7-mile stretch of Southern California coastline will remain closed until officials determine.
The announcement hit like a tidal wave. Every single beach along California's world-famous coastline shut down indefinitely. For generations, California has been the symbol of surfboards, sunsets, and endless freedom by the ocean. But overnight, that dream dissolved into barricades, warning signs, and a creeping unease. The reason? A discovery so chilling, it forced the government's hand. A massive fracture, torn open deep beneath the Pacific, stretching for miles and showing signs of widening. Hidden just below the waves, it was as though the Earth itself had ripped apart. In silence, and no one knew what would happen next, scientists had been monitoring tectonic pressure along the Pacific coast for decades. Earthquakes, after all, are part of California's identity. But what they stumbled upon this time wasn't a familiar fault line. This was something new. Seafloor sensors picked up anomalies, tremors without clear epicenters, shifting patterns in water pressure, and then, unmistakably, the outline of a rupture. Not a hairline fracture, not a small scar on the ocean floor, but a gash so wide it spanned miles. Some instruments even suggested it was still growing. That single revelation changed everything. Because once the seabed itself shows signs of tearing, all the rules of predictability vanish. Could it trigger landslides under the water? Tsunamis capable of swallowing coastlines? Or worse, a domino effect with the San Andreas and other fault systems inland? Nobody could say for sure. And uncertainty was the most dangerous possibility of all. Closing the beaches wasn't just about caution, it was about survival. Officials knew that if the crack suddenly shifted, thousands of people could be trapped in seconds with no way to escape. So, mile by mile, California's 800+ miles of golden sand were cleared. Police tape stretched across lifeguard towers. Surfboards gathered dust. Families who had packed coolers for the weekend found only locked gates and warning signs. Drone footage of Santa Monica Pier, once teeming with tourists, now eerily abandoned, spread online like wildfire. For Californians, it was surreal, as though the heartbeat of their state had been silenced overnight. California's coastline isn't just scenery, it's an artery that pumps billions into the economy. Hotels, surf shops, fishing charters, and coastal restaurants depend on the constant rhythm of beachgoers. Within days, bookings evaporated. Reservations were cancelled en masse. Businesses that had relied on summer crowds were suddenly gasping for air. And yet, as devastating as the economic shock was, experts warned of something far bigger lurking in the depths. The possibility that this fracture was only the first sign of a looming catastrophe. Geologists explained that underwater cracks aren't just scars, they can be gateways for pressure, a sign of pent-up energy waiting to escape. If that energy released violently, the consequences could be catastrophic. One scenario, underwater landslides that displace entire columns of water, generating tsunamis far more destructive than typical earthquakes. Another, the crack linking to deeper tectonic systems, potentially destabilizing California's very continental shelf. The fact that the rupture was underwater made it worse. Unlike inland quakes, where sensors and monitoring are abundant, the ocean hides its secrets. Even with modern sonar, most of the seabed remains a blind spot, which raises the unsettling question: if one fracture this massive slipped past detection until now, how many others might still be lurking in the dark? For ordinary Californians, the closure wasn't just about missing a day at the beach. It was about identity. Surf culture, weekend picnics, festivals by the pier, all of it vanished in a single announcement. Children asked their parents why the ocean had been taken away from them. Surfers, who lived by the rhythm of the tide, suddenly found themselves stranded on dry land. Fishermen tied up their boats, their livelihoods paused indefinitely. It felt less like a precaution, and more like being locked out of a piece of California's soul. For the scientific community, the crack was both terrifying and irresistible. It was a once-in-a-generation chance to study tectonic shifts as they happened in real time. Research vessels scrambled to the site, carrying submersibles, sonar equipment, and robotic drones. Every data point, the heat flux, the seismic echoes, The chemical composition of the surrounding water was critical. Could the crack stabilize? Or was it building toward something far worse? Behind closed doors, some scientists whispered about the possibility of a rift zone, a tear in the crust where new seafloor could eventually form. If that were true, it could permanently reshape California's coastline and ocean currents. But for now, it was speculation. And speculation wasn't enough to calm public fear. The rest of the United States, and even the world, couldn't look away. News outlets replayed footage of empty beaches, eerily still, except for waves crashing against deserted shores. Social media erupted with hashtags, theories, and wild speculation. Other coastal states began reviewing their own monitoring systems. What if a hidden crack lay off the shores of New York or Florida? Suddenly, the vulnerability of living near the ocean felt more universal than ever. But something strange happened once the beaches fell quiet. Wildlife returned. Seals lounged undisturbed on empty sandbars. Dolphins swam closer to shore. Seabirds nested in peace. Marine biologists noted that, in just weeks, ecosystems seemed to breathe easier without the constant crush of human activity. It was a haunting paradox. While humans pulled back in fear, the ocean's creatures thrived in the silence left behind. California has always been more than just geography. It's an idea, immortalized in films, music, and art. But the sudden emptiness of its coastlines sparked something deeper. Artists began painting deserted piers and abandoned lifeguard towers. Poets compared the crack in the seabed to cracks in society itself, symbols of fragility we'd rather ignore. Indigenous communities spoke of ancestral stories about the land and sea splitting apart, warning that these cycles had been foretold long before modern science gave them names. The crack was no longer just geological. It was cultural, psychological, even spiritual. Behind the scenes, politicians and emergency managers scrambled. Evacuation routes were reviewed. Early warning systems were tested. Futurists proposed radical ideas: floating infrastructure, artificial islands, even relocating coastal communities inland. Insurance companies recalculated risks. Real estate markets froze. Anxiety soared, with therapists reporting rising cases of ocean-related nightmares in children. The shutdown had become more than a temporary measure. It was a trial run for a future Californians had always feared, but never truly faced. What happens when the ocean, the very heart of their state, turns uncertain? For all its beaches and beauty, California has always lived under nature's shadow. Earthquakes, fires, droughts, reminders that control is an illusion. The underwater crack was simply the latest chapter in that story. Closing the beaches wasn't just about safety, it was an act of humility. A recognition that, for all our satellites, sensors, and science, the Earth still holds mysteries powerful enough to halt one of the world's largest economies overnight. And maybe that's the real story here, not just a crack in the seabed, but a crack in the way we see ourselves, not as masters of the planet, but as guests living on shifting ground. California's coastline remains closed. The crack remains hidden, stretching silently beneath the Pacific. Scientists continue their studies. Families wait. Businesses adapt. And in that waiting, California has entered a new chapter, one written not in sun-bleached postcards, but in the uneasy silence of empty beaches. Because sometimes, the most powerful reminder isn't destruction, it's the pause before it. 7-mile stretch of Southern California coastline will remain closed until officials determine the announcement that the United States government has officially shut down every beach along the California coastline after the detection of a massive underwater crack spread quickly and with a chilling intensity. California, known for its endless stretches of golden sand, vibrant surf culture, and economic dependence on both tourism and coastal industries, was suddenly thrust into a moment of uncertainty unlike anything in recent memory. The ocean, which has always been both a symbol of beauty and a reminder of nature's power, has revealed a hidden vulnerability beneath its surface. That vulnerability, a deep fracture carved into the seafloor, has forced an unprecedented decision to close the state's beaches indefinitely. Before we start, Smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The detection of the crack did not come out of nowhere. Marine geologists, seismic experts, and oceanographers had long studied the tectonic pressures accumulating along the Pacific coast. But what set this event apart was the scale of the anomaly. This was not a hairline fissure, nor a minor geological quirk. Instead, sensors revealed an immense rupture beneath the waters, stretching for miles and displaying signs of continuous widening. It was as if the Earth itself had shifted and torn apart in silence, hidden beneath the vast Pacific. With that discovery, the logic behind the decision to shut down the beaches became evident. No one could predict what might happen next, and human safety could no longer be guaranteed along California's shores. The implications of the closure were felt instantly. California's coastline is not just a natural wonder, but also an economic artery. Millions flocked to its beaches annually, generating billions in revenue for local businesses. From small surf shops to sprawling hotels, the sudden ban created a ripple effect. Tourists were evacuated, reservations were cancelled, and industries, tied to the ocean, found themselves cut off overnight. Yet, while the economic disruption was immense, it palled in comparison to the deeper concern haunting experts. What did this underwater crack really mean for California's future? The fracture represented more than just a structural anomaly. Geologists warned that it might be tied to deeper tectonic activity along the Pacific Plate, raising questions about whether the state was on the verge of a more catastrophic geological event. California already carries the reputation of being earthquake country, its very identity shaped by fault lines like the San Andreas. But this new discovery was different. Lying beneath the sea, directly linked to an environment that holds unfathomable power, the crack's presence suggested stored energy that could, if released violently, trigger massive underwater landslides, tsunamis, or seismic events capable of reshaping not only California's coastline, but also the lives of millions who live along it. Shutting down the beaches was both a symbolic and practical move. It symbolized a recognition that humanity, for all its progress, remains vulnerable to forces it cannot fully control. On a practical level, it was an act of precaution. Crowded beaches meant crowded escape routes, and officials feared that any sudden escalation, whether a tremor or a surge of water, would leave thousands trapped in harm's way. The closure was a way to clear the board, to buy time, to allow scientists and engineers to study the fracture without the pressure of looming casualties. In towns like Santa Monica, Huntington Beach, and San Diego, the sight of barricades across sandy entrances felt surreal. For generations, these spaces were open to the public, places of freedom, recreation, and connection to the ocean. Now, police tape and warning signs told a different story. Families who had planned weekend picnics found themselves staring at closed gates. Surfers whose lives revolved around the tides were suddenly landed. Fishermen and charter boat operators dependent on direct access to the sea were told to halt operations indefinitely. The very heartbeat of coastal California seemed interrupted. The magnitude of the underwater crack raised questions about how well-prepared society really is for sudden geological revelations. Despite decades of seismic research, the ocean has remained a frontier of mystery. The crack served as a reminder that beneath the waves, the Earth is restless, shifting, and often beyond the reach of constant monitoring. Detection equipment caught the fracture only because it was part of an expanded network of seabed sensors, many of which were only recently installed. That detail left many to wonder how many other hidden threats remain undetected beneath the Pacific. For California's residents, the closure stirred emotions that went far deeper than inconvenience. There was an underlying unease that the very ground beneath their state was betraying them. It was not just about the inability to sunbathe, swim, or surf. It was about confronting the fragility of living in a region where nature and danger coexist side by side. Parents explained to their children why their favorite summer pastime was suddenly off limits, and communities, accustomed to relying on the ocean's proximity, felt a sense of loss, as though a vital part of their identity had been suspended. At the governmental level, the decision to close every beach demonstrated an extraordinary step of caution. Officials acknowledged the backlash that would inevitably follow, particularly from industries and residents dependent on coastal access. But the risk outweighed the resistance. California's beaches stretched for more than 800 miles, and closing every single one required coordination between state, federal, and local agencies. It was a logistical undertaking in its own right, deploying law enforcement, posting notices, rerouting traffic, and even setting up aerial patrols to ensure compliance. The scope of the action mirrored the scale of the threat. Beyond California, the rest of the nation watched with a mix of shock and curiosity. The state has long served as both an economic powerhouse and a cultural symbol, and the sudden silencing of its beaches was news that could not be ignored. In cities like New York and Chicago, news networks replayed images of deserted shorelines, once bustling with life, now eerily empty. The discovery of the underwater crack became a point of discussion about national security, infrastructure resilience, and the unpredictability of natural systems. Other coastal states began reviewing their own monitoring systems, wondering if they too might be blindsided by hidden fractures in the seafloor. Scientists approached the event with a sense of urgency, but also fascination. The crack provided a rare opportunity to study a live geological event in real time, a chance to gather data on how Earth systems evolve beneath the ocean's surface. Teams of researchers prepared expeditions to deploy submersibles, sonar imaging, and pressure sensors directly into the zone of rupture. Every reading, every sample of rock, every seismic echo carried potential to reveal whether the fracture was stabilizing or preparing for something more drastic. Yet the scale of the shutdown showed that despite scientific excitement, the authorities had chosen prudence above curiosity. The ecological implications of the crack also entered the conversation. California's coastlines are ecosystems teeming with life. From kelp forests to migrating whales, a fracture of this size could disrupt marine habitats, altering currents and releasing gases or minerals long trapped beneath the seabed. Conservationists raised alarms about potential harm to species already struggling with climate change, pollution, and overfishing. The closure of the beaches also indirectly protected these ecosystems by reducing human interference, but it did not shield them from the deeper unseen consequences of the geological shift itself. Communities along the coast began to adapt, but not without strain. For smaller towns, dependent almost exclusively on beach tourism, the closure was devastating. Restaurants that relied on heavy weekend traffic saw empty tables. Hotels that boasted oceanfront views had to refund bookings. Even local festivals, often tied to beachside traditions, faced cancellation. The sense of economic shock reverberated inland as well. For California's beaches are not just for locals, but draw millions from across the country and around the world. The sudden halt represented a loss not only of income, but of cultural continuity. Yet, within this disruption, there was also an undeniable sense of awe. The idea that an invisible crack beneath the ocean could bring one of the world's largest economies to a standstill highlighted the enduring power of natural forces. It was humbling to realize that despite satellites orbiting the Earth and technology advancing at a rapid pace, the ground beneath the Pacific could still shift in ways that left humanity scrambling. The closure of California's beaches was not merely an inconvenience. It was a stark reminder that human civilization rests upon a planet that is alive, dynamic, and ultimately beyond complete control. The event also sparked renewed debates about preparedness and infrastructure resilience. If an underwater crack could force an entire state to shut down its coastline, what might happen if it escalated into something more? Discussions emerged about early warning systems, evacuation routes, and the need for coastal communities to rehearse disaster scenarios. The shutdown was not just about present safety, but also about testing readiness for an uncertain future. Politicians, emergency managers, and community leaders faced pressure to show that they were not simply reacting, but planning, learning, and adapting from the event.